All right. Thank you for coming to this little session this afternoon to introduce the Safe Working Group. My name's Liz Rice. You might have seen me earlier on the keynote stage. I am Technology Evangelist with Aqua Security, and I'm also involved with this Safe Working Group, which is still relatively new and establishing itself. Yeah, in fact, we are not technically an officially approved working group yet, but we're very much expecting to be so any day now. So, some very good code gets written by people who don't necessarily know very much about security. And so sometimes security gets sort of deferred to late stages of a project, or it's often not a priority in the early days of a project. And also, if we think about the building blocks of cloud-native components, we need to be able to operate the whole stack in a secure and safe way. We need to be able to keep our end users' data safe. Come on in. We need to know that we're not going to lose personal information, that we're not going to allow people to hack our deployments, we're not going to allow people to use our resources unapproved. So security is really important. Safety of data is really important. But for all sorts of reasons, whether it's knowledge or a lack of confidence, often security doesn't really get considered right at the get-go. So that's really why we wanted to put together this security working group. Because we're not actually an official CNCF working group yet, our GitHub repo is still under this thing, CN-security. It will ultimately move to the CNCF. That's supposed to be CN for Cloud Native, not CN for China, which is confusing when you're here. So you can go to that GitHub repo and sort of see where we are. The original founding team, JJ from Twitter, he's now moved to Tetrate, and Sarah from Google pretty much had the idea at KubeCon CloudNativeCon in Austin last year, so roughly a year ago. And then they were quickly joined by Dan Shaw, who's just recently started at PayPal. But these people have a lot of experience and have some really good ideas around communicating and collaborating on security across the cloud-native stack. So the objective of the group is to help the cloud-native projects think about security in consistent ways and to help end users understand how to operate cloud-native software in a safe and secure way. So we really think we have these two constituencies that we're dealing with. The projects in the CNCF, some of whom may not really be security-orientated projects, but may have some security issues to deal with, like even as simple as setting up TLS connections. And then the other group is the end users who may need to understand how to set up, how to configure, how to operate their cloud-native stack in a secure way. So this was kind of the reason behind JJ and Sarah and Dan setting up the working group. And since they first had the idea, there is, I think it's around 20 different organizations who are represented in the working group, in the meetings and so on the mailing list. Is that me? We have this concept of putting together a safe landscape. I should probably say what SAFE stands for. It stands for Secure Access for Everyone. We want people to be able to understand what sort of security features different projects are bringing to the table. So there are some projects that actually add security features in a cloud-native stack. For example, things like Spiffy, or which gives identity, or Notary and TUF, which help with the signing of images. So we want to make it easier for people to understand where these projects sit in the cloud native landscape. We've identified that compliance is actually a really, it's a big challenge for a lot of users of cloud native software. So for example, if they need to meet things like PII, GDPR, FedRAMP for the US government, there are all sorts of compliance regulations. But if you take a cloud native stack, you deploy Kubernetes and all the other pieces around it, it's not obvious how you can comply with those regulations. So rather than having every different end user going off and figuring that out for themselves, we felt that it would be a good idea to have a centralized place for sharing that expertise. And then finally, sort of security auditing. Now, CNCF projects already get a security audit that's funded by the CNCF. But there's a feeling that actually the expectations of that and the process for that could be better explained and sort of defined more broadly across the whole CNCF. So a little bit more about the compliance part of things. Things like PCI, things like HIPAA have rules and regulations that, they're not always defined in the clearest of ways, and they certainly don't tell you how to map their requirements into configuration settings on different pieces of software. But it would be really useful for operators of those projects to be able to know how those mappings should work and to have best practice guidelines on how to meet their compliance requirements. We'd like to be able to help CNCF projects understand their position in relation to things like compliance. So for example, a really basic example would be that GDPR requires you to encrypt data, certainly at least in storage. It's kind of sketchy on whether or not you really have to encrypt it in transit. If you're a project that has anything to do with storage, do you have some guideline or some setting that relates to encryption that you should be flagging up to say, this is important if you want to meet GDPR? And then also is this idea of being a central working group, a kind of common place that can communicate between the CNCF and the various different standards bodies out there. So the different organizations that put together these compliance guidelines, other sort of security organizations. There are things like the CIS, the Center for Internet Security, who have guidelines that relate to cloud native projects, well, certainly for Kubernetes and Docker. So having a well-defined path to communicate between those different bodies and the CNCF seems to be a good idea. And so basically, this is a super fast run-through of what we're there to achieve. But basically, we would love to see more people joining. I could probably start again. There's like a whole new crew coming. Hi. That's okay. Thank you for coming. You know what? I will go back a bit because we've just got like double the audience, so I'm going to rewind a bit. So the SAFE working group, it stands for Secure Access for Everyone. And the idea is to help the cloud native projects think about security in a consistent way and to communicate it in a consistent way to end users. And then to help end users understand how to operate their cloud native stack in a secure way. So if you think about pulling together all the different CNCF projects, all these different building blocks, at the moment, there isn't a sort of consistent place to talk about securely operating those components. Yeah, we have about 20 different organizations currently represented in the working group. And these are kind of three main initiatives that we've been working on. One is a landscape to try to understand what security best practices should be in a cloud-native environment and how those map to the different projects. So, for example, some of the projects like Spiffy or Notary are directly, or Linkerd as a service mesh, they've got some directly security-related features, or they may be absolutely about security. And we want to help users understand how those different components play a part in securing their cloud-native deployment. We want to help operators of cloud-native stacks understand how to meet compliance and regulatory requirements. And we also want to kind of standardize how different projects get a security audit from the CNCF. It's one of the benefits of the CNCF, being a CNCF project. But we felt that there could probably be a little bit more common understanding of what those security audits should be and what passing the audit really means. So yeah, diving a bit into the compliance part again, this is the idea that if you need to operate a cloud-native stack in compliance with one of these standards like PCI or FedRAMP or HIPAA, there are lots of different organizations who are going through the same challenges, who also have to meet these compliance requirements, and we should try and have a centralized body for thinking about how to configure your cloud-native stack to meet those requirements. I think as we have more and more projects under the CNCF umbrella, it will be important to identify when they impact on these compliance requirements and help the projects communicate to their users how to meet compliance requirements. And then the SAFE working group can also be a kind of central point of communication between the CNCF and these security-related standards bodies and security-related organizations. So for the people who just came in, we aren't technically yet an official CNCF working group, although we expect that to happen any minute now. So for the time being, we're still on GitHub at cn-security, nothing to do with China. Done that joke twice now. So cloud native security /safe. That will obviously move under the CNCF any day now. We have a working group. We do, actually, at the moment, we've got 2 weekly meetings happening on Thursdays and Fridays. I suspect the Thursday one may be a slightly friendlier time zone for China, but neither of them are great. Not super for me in London either. Yeah, so the working group will eventually end up as WG Safe under CNCF. We've got a Slack channel. We're very keen to recruit some new members, and I think at the moment we're still getting off the ground. It's still very early days, so if you have an interest in security and compliance, now is a really good time to get involved. We have all these sort of ambitions to be able to talk about security in a consistent way, but there's going to be quite a lot of work involved in doing that. And I think also to figure out how the different projects meet compliance requirements and meet security requirements is going to be a significant amount of work. So we'd love to have more people involved in this group. So that is a super fast run through of what the SAFE working group is there to achieve. And I think at this point I would be very happy to hear, who's here and why are you here and what would you like to see out of a security working group from the CNCF? Any takers to answer that question? Have we got any end users in the room? Or are you all from kind of vendor companies? Okay.
So I understand that it's kind of a compliance base, but I also understand that you can also meet compliance with multiple types of solutions. So is the idea kind of to link the technology to compliance, or just to kind of make a best list of like fairly vague best practices that can be met with technology?
Yeah, I think it would be more like a set of best practices and understanding how these pieces fit together. So for example, in the cloud native landscape, you know that landscape they've got with the 50 million projects on it, and quite a lot of those projects have some relationship to security. Some of them are all about security, some of them have some, you know, if you didn't configure them right, that would really dramatically affect your security posture. And that seems like a pretty confusing thing to present to end users. So we want to try and clarify that for end users. Exactly how we do that and how we present that information is totally up for grabs at this point. I mean, you'll see if you go to the GitHub repo, we've got things like some use cases and personas and some sort of starting points of the outputs that we'd like to generate related to things like compliance. But we don't, you know, we haven't done any final deliverables yet, so time is right. Hi.
Hey, you know, like within large organizations, a lot of security teams don't have a good understanding of how cloud native applications work and how can you do security on a container basis. They have like a more traditional firewall approach security. So like this work group also wants to make it easier for like security teams on the large organizations to understand how they can approach security at a cloud native application.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yes. And I think it's sort of a little bit buried in there in talking about things like the landscape, but I think you're absolutely right. We should have something more defined to say, here is the, you know, the persona is a security person with an understanding of traditional security. How do we educate them on, I think that's a great idea. Any other questions? Hi, new people. We pretty much ran through already. I'm just at the discussion point. Hello, got a question here. Someone's coming with a mic. I think because it gets recorded, but it's good to have the mic.
Do you have some projects now for safe work group?
Sorry, can you repeat that again? Do we have some projects?
Do we have some projects in prepare for CNCF?
That are prepared for CNCF?
Yeah.
Yes. Not from the working group's perspective, so it's still really early days. I mean, there's security-related projects exist, if that's... Okay, so SysDig recently donated Falco, which is security-related. Spiffy, which is to do with identity, which is very tied up with security.
Last question. Do we consider the safety container in our safe work group?
What, the security of a container itself?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I think we should, because partly if we think of it holistically, you know, if we're dealing with the security team from a traditional organization, we need to be able to explain to them that what the security implications of moving to containers are and how they can do that safely. And also just the existence of things like Containerd as a CNCF project. I mean, that's in the scope of the CNCF. So I think talking about container security is appropriate, yeah.
My problem is now we use run C, you run C and start a container. We know it is not safe because we use the C group and the namespace to run container. Not safe, such as Google published the divider, and he say it's safe more. we are working on this.
Right. So I think that's one of those areas where it is quite contentious, right? If you say, for example, well, Brandon will have some thoughts on this. And like Jess Frizzell, for example, who is pretty much the queen of container safety, and she will point out that she's got a thing called Contained AF, and it's running in containers with a seccomp profile that she built. And there are a lot of people have tried to get into that, and they've never managed to breach it. So she'll put that out as an example of, in reality, containers are basically safe. And there are, and there have been instances where vulnerabilities have been found and patched, and there are things you can do to make a container really unsafe. Like you can mount the host root directory into it, and that's a really bad idea, but you can do it. And then you can say, well, actually, I would rather have a different level of isolation, and then things like Nabla come into it, or gvisor. But gvisor just had a vulnerability 2 weeks ago, so there is no code that's safe, right? Brandon, do you want to say anything in relation to that?
Yeah, I guess I can add that. I think you're talking about this. There's a vulnerability that's have to do with the memory subsystem, right? That I think, so I think the thing that at least we did in the research at IBM was that there's always, whether you're using a hypervisor or using a container, right? There is always this lowest shared privilege component that you're using, right? And so if you imagine any kernel exploit, right? Whether you isolate the resources or anything, if you are able to exploit the lower level privilege component, then you break isolation. And like gvisor is a good because they've basically taken some of the functionality and put filters on it, and there's some guarantees on it. For Nabla containers, we do like the seccomp profiling. I know Aqua has seccomp profiling also with dynamic using heuristics and stuff like that. So I mean, if you imagine every container workload, that if I specifically found a very small seccomp profile for every container, I could basically minimize my risk of exploitation. So for example, if you run it with runc, but you only have you run only services which use maybe 5 syscalls, right? Then you can imagine that your exposure running runc with that specific container workloads on that host compared to another host with a different set of container workloads would have different isolation guarantees. Right.
And I think also the point about isolation requirements will vary from organization to organization. Like if you have a multi-tenancy, that's a different, you have different isolation concerns than if you are, if you can trust every user on the same host, you have different isolation requirements. Yeah,
like with federal customers, sometimes they're like, if I really want this service to be secure, I just buy a new worker and just the application just sits on that worker. So it's kind of, you can solve the problem with money in a sense.
Yeah. And I think also, I can get quite excited about, the kind of container isolation thing, but it's just one part of this whole stack of components. And, it's totally plausible to create really insecure situations. Like, you can set up Kubernetes and leave a port open for unauthenticated access, and that's going to create, it's effectively the same as root access across your cluster. So just making sure that people know and trying to encourage more secure defaults across all these different components, I think, is really part of the goal.
Sorry if I dragged the discussion a bit towards the
No, it's good. I can talk about that. That's fun. I like that. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we would really love to have more people participating in the working group, and as I say, it's very early days, so helping set the direction and figure out what our priorities should be. Like everything else in this community, it's done by people deciding that that's what they're interested in. So we'd love to have more people involved. Any other questions or thoughts or contributions? Yeah.
How can we join your work, your security work?
Yeah, so the best thing to do is if you can join one of those calls, if you go to the GitHub repo, it publishes the dial-in details. You can join in that safe working group channel in the CNCF Slack and just say hi. It's still a pretty small group. We've still got. There's I can't remember what it's called, like a README or something like that, with a list of people who are interested, and you can just add yourself to that and send a pull request. And someone will probably say, "Okay, have you been on a call?" And just try and figure out what your interest is. Yeah. And I think, at the moment, these times are definitely not China-friendly times. So I think we probably will need to address that as more people join the group. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts?
So how many companies have joined your group? Sorry.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much everybody who's. In many cases, it's one person from each of these organisations at this point. But it's clearly a lot of companies that are interested in security, and they're interested in, building a more secure. For all of us, I think being able to help raise the level of security across cloud-native components, it's good for everyone.
Sorry, just to come back to this. So I was wondering whether does the scope of this also include things like multi-cloud or hybrid, or just kind of looking at a single cluster?
I don't see why it shouldn't. Although at the moment, I think multi-cloud is quite a. It's not terribly well addressed across the whole ecosystem right now. So
it's not very well defined. So
I think we would probably want to say, well, the scope is whatever is considered to be cloud native, but maybe multi-cloud wouldn't be the first thing on the list. Okay, great. Please do feel free to come and join the working group, and come and chat after if there's anything else you want to discuss. All right. Thank you very much.